Hi, everyone, and welcome once again to our weekly Let's Talk Risk conversation. First, Happy New Year to all of you. I'm so excited to connect with you once again, and I hope you guys had a great holiday season, relaxing holiday season, and now off to a great start in the new year. So I wish you guys all the best ahead in this new year and hope to see all of you every week here on Let's Talk Risk. Guys, I'm excited to welcome Edie Edens today. And this is going to be a fascinating conversation because this topic, even I don't know that much about. So it'll be a learning experience for me. We're going to talk about privacy laws as it applies to clinical trials. And Edie is an expert in that area. So you might wonder how it links to risk management. Maybe when we talk about risk management on this forum, what's privacy law got to do with that? Well, a lot, actually. If you think about privacy of information, that is considered to be a personal property of our users and patients, right? Under 14971, damage to property and environment is a harm. That's right, correct? So it is very important for us to be mindful of protecting personal information, including health-related information of our patients and doctors. And when it comes to clinical trials, it becomes even more interesting, right? More critical. So with that, Edie, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me. I am absolutely delighted to be on here talking to your audience, and hopefully some of my own network has joined just to talk through some of these important pieces and how much privacy law actually does connect to risk.
Okay. So guys, before we dig into this, I want to invite you to continue to share your thoughts and comments on the chat. And if you guys want to join us live on stage here, please let us know. And I will actually bring you over here. There are instructions in the comments section of the event page. So if you want to join us on this studio, click that link and join us here. But share your thoughts. Tell us where you're joining us from and maybe give us a little intro. So Edie, let's jump right into it. First of all, just to set the stage, tell us why we should be concerned about privacy laws in the first place, especially in clinical trials.
Absolutely. So, as so many of us in any facet of healthcare or clinical trials know, we have some very, very sensitive data in our possession many, many times, right? And it's moving through our systems, it's moving through our computers. And the patients that are giving us that data about themselves, or that we are learning their data through the processes that they navigate with us, they have expectations that we are going to protect it, just like state law and federal law in the United States has many expectations about how you're going to protect it. And it's often, I feel like, because we are so focused in healthcare and in clinical trials on the safety of the patient, and I mean that in the most literal way, right? Like that the device does not cause any harm to the patient, that the act of being in the clinical trial does not create more burden, or that the investigational product or drug that we're asking them to take, we know potential side effects, we know the harms that could come from it, right? And that we tell the patients that they enter into a knowledgeable contract about this. What we don't always give as much clout is that the patients are thinking we're going to protect all of their data. And in fact, that is a risk in and of itself. It may not be the same risk as, of course, bodily harm, but it is still a very serious risk. And it's a serious risk not only because we are respecting the patient's privacy and we're respecting the fact that they're willing to, trust us with their healthcare. It's also the fact that, identity theft, credit card theft, scams, etc., those are prevalent right now. And data leaks and data breaches provide opportunities for those who are up to no good to do just that.
Yeah.
And the last thing you would want is, in addition to seeing a patient who is in suffering, right?
Yeah.
Some malady, oh, let me add something more to your cart here, right? And so I think we get lost because we're so interested or so focused, rightfully so, on the physical harms. We don't always think about the privacy. And also the way we think about privacy. Like, I know even in clinic or at sites that are very good at what they do in terms of clinical care and clinical trials, they'll still go, oh, did you do the HIPAA?
Yes.
And I'm like, oh, no, that's not how that works. Yeah. That's not even what that is. No. And you can tell there's a sense of, I know I need to protect, or I know I shouldn't share information, but there's also a sense of like, this is just a little bit of overkill.
Yeah.
This just isn't as important as the physical safety that I have.
So let's talk about that a little bit. it's definitely a risk, right? And because it's a risk, I think there's a regulatory and a legal framework around it. And you just mentioned HIPAA. So let's briefly talk about what HIPAA is and if there are any other regulatory or legal sort of laws that we should be thinking about. What are those?
Yeah, absolutely. So HIPAA is in the United States, your primary first privacy law that's federal that people think about. It's going to be the one, if you know anything about privacy law in the US, you're going to know about HIPAA. And I always like to remind people a couple different things that folks don't always know, and I don't expect you to, but HIPAA was actually formed to create the ability for patients to own their own data and have a better interoperability and transferability when they were being seen at multiple different centers, hospitals, physician offices. Because before HIPAA in the United States, your doctor owned your medical record. You, as a patient, did not. And a lot of folks don't realize that. So when you would go, hey, I've got to be seen by a specialist in another state, I've got to go to this other, office, getting your medical record was actually quite onerous. You didn't own it. You didn't have the rights to it. And doctors don't want to lose their patients. And it's a lot of work to transfer records, especially back in the days of mail and fax, right, as opposed to email. And so this became a huge issue. It really took on a life of its own in terms of now how we think about what we have to do in healthcare and life sciences, in terms of, not identifying patients, ensuring that we keep their information secure, ensuring that, only certain individuals have access to that information. And so I think in the application of HIPAA, we're much more concerned about a breach or not understanding what PHI is, or someone at our research center seeing something they shouldn't see or that they shouldn't have had access to. But it wasn't really the origin story of HIPAA. Do you know what I mean? Like, that wasn't really the spirit of the law when it was created. It's just transformed into that. And that's point one. Point two that I always like to make for folks in clinical trials that a lot of people really do not understand is when you go into a clinical trial and you sign the HIPAA authorization form, you are saying as a patient, I recognize you, provider, clinical trial principal investigator, might have to dig into my HIPAA protected health records to see if I qualify for this trial. So I'm giving you access to that. I'm saying you are allowed to go pull these medical records that you otherwise do not have the rights to. And I'm authorizing you under HIPAA to look at that information. But HIPAA itself stops applying the minute you are in the clinical trial and the data that's being generated is clinical trial data.
So that's interesting. That's kind of an interesting fact for me. I did not know that. Can you say a little bit more about it?
Yeah, most people don't. I mean, at the risk of sounding even nerdier than I already sound on a privacy podcast, most folks really, really, really don't understand that. It's a very complicated nuance. It doesn't mean that clinical trial data is not its own confidential, privacy, regulated data. What it means is HIPAA wasn't inclusive of clinical trials in terms of how your data is regulated. And so you need to understand that interaction to appropriately set up and work in clinical trials. And a lot of times it's where in my own practice, I see vendors who maybe you're in patient recruitment for clinical trials. So you're not the research site. You're never going to do a study visit with the patient. You're just reaching out in common marketing channels, like on, say, Facebook, and saying, I'm helping someone find the right patients for a migraine trial, just say. So you're not asking them to share anything other than, hi, I willfully talk to you. My name's Edie, and I'm telling you I have migraines and I'd be interested in research. None of that is protected health information, especially if you, the patient, choose to disclose that and you weren't required to or forced to. And so it can create a very unique situation for a vendor in that space where they're going, you know what? I'm not subject to HIPAA. I only work in clinical trials, and I'm going way out of my way to make sure I don't get any PHI and that I don't cross the clinical threshold line and that I stay firmly in clinical trial land where, I protect the data, but it's not HIPAA regulated data.
I see.
And so it creates a very interesting conundrum for my clients in that space, because they go, well, I don't want to be subject to more laws than I have to.
Yeah.
But also, I promise the patient who's talking to you in that clinical trial thinks that you're HIPAA compliant because they think their data is protected by HIPAA.
Oh, got you. Very interesting. Very interesting. So see, such a nuanced area, even in HIPAA. So Edie, let's talk about another law that has just come about, like GDPR in Europe, right? And that's
Yes.
a big one. So can you give us a
Another
brief
one.
overview of GDPR?
Yeah, created for very different reasons and has a very different scope. So go figure, 10 years ago, if you had told anyone they would prefer HIPAA over another privacy law, they would probably giggle at you and go, you don't know what you're talking about. HIPAA's a lot. GDPR, I would argue, has firmly taken that stance. And the reason is GDPR is not tied entirely to health data,
Okay.
whereas HIPAA is.
I see.
So the whole scope of the two laws is different. The reason for the creation, this is where, again, that origin story becomes important. For the EU and GDPR, what they're looking at specifically is all forms of personal data. So the scope of what data is protected is much broader than HIPAA, which is why a lot of folks feel like it's frankly much more to tackle, right? And it's a much harder compliance schema to adhere to.
Sure.
Now, I will say they have plenty of carve-outs in GDPR for research that are, exceptions and that you can use. So it's not as if they didn't think about clinical trials or carve out a space or, a pathway there for you to utilize it in GDPR. It's just more that that particular regulation is not specific to only healthcare related information.
Yeah, awesome.
That's where that difference.
Yeah, so guys, our world is changing fast, right? Technology is evolving and regulations are coming. So welcome everybody. If you're joining just now, we are talking about privacy law, especially in the healthcare space and clinical trials with my guest, Edie Edens. Please continue to share your questions, comments, or any other thoughts that you have in the chat. And if you want to join us live here in the studio, you can. There's a link in the first comment on the event page that you can click and join us in the studio and become a part of this conversation, because that's what it's all about. So Edie, let's keep going. So we talked about HIPAA, we talked about GDPR. Now, from a quality regulatory point of view, many of our listeners in the audience would say, guys, I just worry about ISO 14971, 13485, FDA regulation. At what point do I have to really think about talking to an attorney like you, Edie, if I have a question? How would they make that judgment? What would be your advice to them?
Yeah, usually what I tell folks is you're going to have to sit down and do, a risk identification mapping of some sort. You might call that a gap analysis. You might call it a risk analysis. GDPR calls it a DPIA, and there's lots of different vernacular for it. But the point is that you're sitting down, as an organization, or if, for example, you're launching a new product, right, around that specific launch, around that specific project, and saying, I need to pre-identify my liability and risk. Now, you can probably get a decent distance on your own, especially if your organization has some great compliance folks in it already. The internet's an amazing thing these days, but you're going to need to know what you're looking for.
Yeah.
And that's where it helps to talk to a professional, because you can sit down and identify what you believe all your risks are, knowing your organization better than, say, I do, knowing your medical device, better than I do. But I'm going to sit there and ask you a litany of questions, not just across these federal or country-based laws that we talked about, but also based on individual nuances at state law. Which state are you in?
Yeah.
Where are you seeing patients? Where are you doing your trials? What kinds of interactions are you going to have?
Yeah.
Potential, business prospects, if you will. Like, do you have to advertise? Do you have to do reach out? And are you going to be reaching out in ways that track cookies or involve any type of pixel tracking when you're interacting with business prospects? So there's several more layers of nuance that my guess is the average consumer, the average listener here today is absolutely aware of the risks of, like you said, any ISO certification quality risks, any type of, needing to have a proactive plan, a QMS, needing to be aware of any type of safety risk of what you're working on. So I don't think that you necessarily immediately need a professional. Not that I want to talk people out of calling me for work. just to sit down and map the risk. But I do think once you've mapped the risk, making sure you have really thought of everything, like the things you don't know are the ones that are going to trip you up,
Yeah.
and understanding the priority.
Yeah.
Now I've got a list of all my problems or my risks, but how do I decide what needs to be tackled today versus in Q4?
Yeah.
And that's where having someone who understands the origin of the regulations, how they get enforced, how you get audited, and also, frankly, I mean, let's face it, lawyers are trained to prepare. We hope for the best, but we prepare for the worst.
Yeah.
And so we're going to know, look, here's where your risks are. If you violate this in GDPR, this particular provision, they could come for this percentage of your company, and that will sink you. So that immediately takes high priority.
Great. So I'm hoping that, conversations like this, I'm hoping they broaden our awareness and our understanding. So, Edie, we have a question here from Alex, and he's asking, with HHS proposing substantial changes to HIPAA security rule, do you see any significant impact to clinical study management? Thank you for asking that question, Alex. Do you have any thoughts on that, Edie?
I do. So I was fortunate to do at my last consulting firm, our privacy officer and I did a fantastic webinar for HCCA on this exact topic. So for those who don't know, HHS is in the midst of proposed, how we love to propose rules, send them out for comments, and then finalize later, right? So that's what the Office of Civil Rights that oversees HIPAA is doing right now with the security rule. And I actually think there's some very positive implications for clinical trials. So it's not so much that I think that these proposed rules are going to make our life more onerous than it already is. I mean, this is already a legal schema that we comply with on a regular basis. It's not going anywhere. But what it is doing is it's clarified in several places, and it's very nuanced. If you want to follow up with me afterward, Alex, I'm happy to go down this rabbit hole. But it's signified in the proposed language several spaces where the sharing of clinical trial data, especially once it is appropriately de-identified, which is all that, we're asking for protection, that, you can't use HIPAA and fall back on HIPAA to not share data or to not approve a project or to, as an IRB, for example, refuse to accept another IRB's plan or approval and do your own review. Because what's happened is HIPAA has become a crutch because folks don't entirely understand it doesn't apply or how and where it doesn't apply in clinical trials. You'll get into a clinical trial setting, you will need to access or share data, and you may be told by a separate provider, another part of the project, oh, you're going to violate HIPAA if you do that. Well, you're not.
Yeah.
You don't know what you're talking about, unfortunately. You're not. But it becomes a crutch for not sharing data, and then it makes conducting the clinical trial and helping the patient a whole heck of a lot harder because people don't, now they're so scared of HIPAA, they won't share.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So the pendulum swung the other way. So what all that very nuanced, sorry to say, is what the new proposed security rule has built into it are nuances and components that basically make this not possible anymore and over clarify that the sharing of data in clinical trials, whether that's with the participant, whether that's, with the public at large for the innovation of science, that is not something HIPAA is trying to stand for.
So this should help. For what I'm hearing you say is that by having a good understanding should actually help us, not hinder our work in clinical trials. Okay, that's great to know. Guys, love this conversation, love these questions and comments. Please continue sharing those. And once again, if you want to join us in the studio live, you are welcome to do so. I know with the new LinkedIn arrangement, it has become a little bit more difficult, but the wonderful thing about our Let's Talk Risk conversations is your participation. And I really encourage you to be a part of this great opportunity to ask questions or share your thoughts with our panel today. So, Edie, let's continue our conversation. What I would like to ask now is, can you share any experience or example that you have come across in your practice that got your attention if something was being done really well or not as well? Anything that stands out to you based on your years of experience when it comes to privacy law?
Yeah, absolutely. So many things. I mean, we could be here for a week.
Yes.
So first and foremost, and I don't mean to beat on the drum, but I think it's really important. The root cause of most privacy missteps that I have seen in my career, where you're coming in to rectify a problem, or an auditor goes, "You're not compliant. You sure think you are." Um, for me, almost 100% of the time, the root of that is a lack of education, training, and understanding of what the privacy rule actually is. Right. So the lack of spending any time actually learning what it's really regulating, what it's really about, and instead just hearing through the grapevine,
Hmm.
what we have to do to be compliant with this privacy law, it'll get you in trouble every single time. And I say that because I've seen, major research and medical facilities that I assure you give excellent clinical care. I'd still go be seen at them today
Hmm.
without any doubt in my mind. But I know for a fact, because of, a misunderstanding of how to share patient data, they've encountered HIPAA violations
Uh-huh.
or other privacy-based violations. And it had nothing to do with the ill will of any of the providers, or, the clinical trial staff. It had nothing to do with the patient not wanting their data to be shared.
Hmm.
It truly was, a mechanism of failure because of a lack of education and training of what channels you could use, and having proper ways and channels to set them up, and not just training a staff member the day that they entered your organization, but continuing to train and
Hmm.
continuing to value that training. And I get it. Trainings can be really boring. No one gets excited when you're like, "Hey, I'm here,
Yes.
compliance team. Let's do 2 hours of training today." Um, but I would encourage organizations on topics that are as important and as monetarily as well as liability wise, large,
Hmm.
like HIPAA, like GDPR, like your state privacy laws. If you cannot create an engaging training, if you create a cultural attitude
Hmm.
where it's like, "Oh, just check that box and just flip through those slides so you can say you did it," you're creating more risk
Yeah,
for your
for
organization
sure.
right then and there.
Hmm.
And that's to me, that's the preventable stuff. Everyone's going to make mistakes. We're all humans in this.
Yeah.
So if somebody accidentally shares something, didn't catch an email that had PHI in it that was still in their inbox, I mean, like, mistakes occur. But the more you can train your staff up front, and the more you can have an open dialogue about, sure, compliance can be burdensome and it can be onerous. It's also very costly to not comply, and it can really hurt people. It can hurt our organization. So let's be positive and come at it from that angle.
Gotcha.
That's the first piece.
Hmm.
That's because what I've seen happen is, because you have so many people working in a clinical setting, and they're used to being able to share data a certain way in that clinical setting,
Yeah.
you can't ask a nurse who's a nurse who's a nurse to not be a nurse between when they're working with a clinical patient and a clinical trial patient.
Yeah.
They still are wearing their nurse hat. They've been trained as a nurse. And so the mistakes that I've seen in terms of, sharing data internally, like at a research center, and catching that technically this was a breach.
Hmm.
It at least didn't go anywhere. It was a contained breach, but oh my gosh, we're doing this on a daily basis. We can't communicate like this.
Hmm.
It's almost always because of that,
Hmm.
because someone just is so used to communicating in the clinical channel with the patient data
Yeah.
a certain way that they don't pivot when they are in clinical trials, or vice versa.
Interesting.
And so they just don't understand. They just don't understand.
Yeah, fascinating, fascinating. So, guys, we still have about 10 minutes or so in our conversation. So, I invite you to share your thoughts, participate in this discussion. So, Edie, while we wait for some more comments or questions to come, I want to change gears a little bit. I know that you have some experience now applying AI in the clinical research domain and also just research in general. Can you give us an overview of what you have done and where the field is going?
Absolutely. So this is a big one. I certainly don't. I'm standing at the feet of giants here. That's a big question to ask. What I will say is, we're seeing an incredible influx in the regulatory and risk management space of the use of AI, in clinical trials right now, right? And we're seeing it at all different points in the life cycle. So you're seeing it as early as the actual test article drug discovery, being able to potentially predict, what investigational items will succeed and which ones won't, so as to, fast track things, save money, not put patients at risk if we don't think something is going to be formidable. And then you're seeing it go throughout the entire clinical trial life cycle from there. As far as, regulatory and quality, you're seeing at the very tip of coming into the clinical trial world, you're seeing a few folks come in and say, look, could we write regulatory applications with AI? So like an IND, for example, or an ID, would that be possible? And you'd still need a human in the driver's seat,
Yeah.
right? But could that save us time and headache? Could that expedite the process? And what you see over and over and over is AI in this particular use case being geared towards saving time and money,
I got you.
which also saves patients, right? And that's the end goal. And so it's all about the pieces in our regulatory and compliance puzzle that are very redundant, but are absolutely necessary, but are incredibly repetitive. How can we make that faster? So after you get through that initial regulatory application phase, then you see a lot of companies who are building platforms where, or I should back up, even before the IND, who are building platforms. So I'm thinking of like a BioFi, where they have a database of regulatory information all over the world that helps you build your regulatory strategy.
Wow.
So then you can go in and at a fingertip look at, okay, I'm going to try my trial in these 3 jurisdictions. I know I'm going to be up against HIPAA in one, GDPR in one, and the Indian privacy health law in India. What do I need to know? And they're even creating specific platforms where you could put in your own policies and procedures and run them up against these regulations to go like, am I compliant? Where am I not compliant? What would I have to do to be compliant?
That's cool. That's really cool.
It's really cool technology. And then you just keep going throughout the clinical trial life cycle. So at every phase now you see, do you want to write your protocol using AI? There's multiple companies that are doing that. Do you want to write your clinical study reports using AI? There's tons of companies that are doing that. So you're seeing it hit the life cycle. And some companies are across multiple parts of the life cycle. Some are really nuanced and are like, I'm just going to stay right here.
I think this is exciting. So we have a question here, Edie, from John. He's asking, can you provide some real-world liability examples that were enforced around privacy or HIPAA? And what were the actual punishment or costs for the company CEO or founder? Could you give us like a broad overview on that?
Yes. So I could give you a dissertation and I'll tell you, John, if you would like to connect, because there's so many cases. Like I'm sitting here thinking I have a whole PowerPoint deck full of cases. I'm going to use a really old case that a lot of people have heard of in the interest of time, just to give you an idea of an example of what happens. So this actually involves paper, which is frankly still used more often than it's not in clinical trials. And this is lovingly called the $1 million New York subway ride, for those in the audience who've heard this story. And I won't name names because I'm not trying to call anybody out, but it is publicly available information that a predominant research center and hospital that you likely know the name of in New York City had a very, very tired clinician going home on the subway and took a host of paper medical records. Some involved clinical trial data, some involved medical records, some were both. And of course, at that time, you had to transport the paper home, and fell asleep on the subway, left the records on the subway when they got up, and they're stopped. And this created a data breach that was large enough, because what happens in HIPAA is, depending on the size of your breach and how contained it is, that sets the stage for what your penalties are going to be like. This was a large enough by volume data breach that even though no harm was proven, like it's not as if we know for a fact any of this medical data was used nefariously, that organization still had to pay $1 million just in penalties and fees. And that's above and beyond the actual individual work hours and steps they had to take to rectify, self-report, contact all patients, etc. And that's a small case.
Fascinating.
GDPR penalties are actually quite a...
So we have to be careful. Great, Edie. So we have one more question from Roger here, kind of a basic question he's asking. If surgery data is shared with me and only identified by hospital case number, I've heard other hospitals say that it's a HIPAA violation and should not be allowed. Do you have a comment on that?
So if we're in clinical, what I need to know is if we're in clinical care or if we're in clinical trials here. So in clinical care, non-clinical trials, if you had a reason to have access to the data, like let's say you were being asked as a provider to be, a second opinion, you're being brought in on a specialty case, something to that avail, then there absolutely could be a reason that you do have a right to see the data and that you wouldn't be violating HIPAA to see it. However, you do have to disclose with the minimum necessary pieces of information. So where the hospital in that situation has to be concerned is, one, do you qualify as an individual who's a part of the care team now and has a reason to have access? And then second step is, how did we share it with you? So there is a way to do all of that without violating HIPAA. There's also a way to do all that very, very much with violating HIPAA. When you get into clinical trials, it's different because, again, it's more regulated by, are you a part of the investigator team? Were you covered by the IRB and FDA approvals? It's not as much about the actual HIPAA regulation of the data.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you so much. So, guys, we have run out of time. Amazing conversation today. We run out of time. Edie, I'm going to give you a couple of minutes to just collect your thoughts and, just share 2 or 3 key takeaways for us as part of this conversation. But guys, I'm going to share with you a few announcements. First, we do this every week. Those of you who are joining for the first time, this is a weekly event, same time every Friday at 11 Eastern. So if you're interested in these conversations, just show up. You will see an announcement in the LinkedIn feed and you will show up. So please mark it on the calendar. And if you miss it, a recording will be available on the Let's Talk Risk newsletter and website. Now, I should tell you that next week we are going to have a very exciting conversation with Amit Tyagi about how to implement a quality management system in your organization effectively beyond just a paper exercise. And also, he is going to share with us some career tips for success. And I wanted to talk to Edie about her fascinating career, but we ran out of time, maybe another time. Okay. With that, I hope you guys continue to show up and continue to participate in these conversations. And Edie, if you could just share with us now a couple of key points from our conversation today.
Yeah, absolutely. And I always love to leave people with really practical, digestible tips here. So in summary, what we're talking about here today is first and foremost, understanding what privacy law applies to what it is you're doing. Don't just blatantly think because you've always been in healthcare, oh, HIPAA must be it, right? Or I'm located in the EU, so I know it's GDPR. That may be true, may also be a whole lot more than that, or a whole lot less than that. So getting to know the origin of the regulation, what it really regulates, what it's really about, and your own process is what should determine what applies, right? Really making sure you know everything that can apply. The second piece is look under the hood. While we love to focus on federal guidelines in healthcare and clinical trials, and that makes good sense, there's a lot of meat in state law around privacy. And most of your privacy laws that you don't know about are probably embedded in your state law. So if you live in, say, California, maybe Texas, you have a very, very different setup than, say, I do in Indiana. And you need to understand that to make sure you understand what extra risks might apply to what you're working on. Those are the 2 pieces. And then the third piece, as I always lovingly say, is continued education. I know it is so hard in a busy, busy, busy world to find time to stay up on things, but understanding and knowing what's coming, like the OCR revision of HIPAA next year, that can really save you a lot of time and heartache, so that you don't set something up that you then just have to rehash 6 months later, right? Because you weren't aware that there was going to be an update.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Edie. Guys, how do you like it? Please share with us your feedback through the emoji icons. I know we don't have a direct conversation here with you, but I want you to have a voice in this conversation. Show us how you're feeling. I want to thank you, Edie, for your time today and sharing with us your insights so generously. I mean, this is, in just 30 minutes, we have packed so much information here. It's amazing. So, Edie, thank you for that.
Well, thank you for the opportunity.
Okay, guys, if you have any thoughts, questions, comments, feedback, just reach out to me directly on LinkedIn or just connect with us. Show up each week and share your thoughts and comments with us. If you have a suggestion for a topic or you want to be a guest speaker, remember, it requires no preparation. So if you want to be a guest speaker, please reach out to me and we would love to have you. With that, everybody, have a good weekend ahead and we will see you once again next week. Thank you so much.